I'm Logan Crawford, and right now on Spotlight, the title selected by my guest for this podcast is Restoring Gospel Truth in Catholic Seminaries, Colleges, and Universities. My guest today is Jerome D. Gilmartin, author of the book, The 7-Step Reason to be Catholic, second edition. Science, the Bible, and history point to Catholicism, with addenda clearing the historical critical fog. It was republished last year, 2022, by Pro Isle Publishing. Mr. Gilmartin's website is 7stepcatholic.com. That's the number 7, STEP Catholic.com. From its earliest days until the 1970s, the Catholic Church taught that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John wrote the Gospels, and in that order, Matthew the Apostle writing first. It brought the church to its pre-Vatican II golden age. But in the 1970s, soon after the Second Vatican Council, Mr. Gilmartin writes that most Catholic seminaries and universities ended that instruction, that students are now taught by a theory developed by a Protestant theologian more than 2 centuries ago, that it is doubtful that evangelists Matthew, Mark, and John, at least, wrote the Gospels, that they were probably written anonymously a generation later. Mark, whoever he was, wrote first. Matthew, whoever he was, used Mark as a source. A lifelong Catholic, Mr. Gilmartin is a 1959 graduate of the University of Scranton with majors in psychology and philosophy, graduate work in psychology at Fordham Graduate School, and through Cornell University. After a career in human resources with a telecom corporation and as a psychological services associate with the state of Pennsylvania, he retired back in 2001. He and his wife, Marie, now reside in the Poconos in the mountains of Pennsylvania. So good to have you here today, Jerome. Many listeners are thinking it can't be true that Catholic priests and bishops have been taught to doubt the evangelists wrote the Gospels.
Well, thanks, Logan, for that kind introduction. And my apologies to viewers. I'll be reading most of what I have to say. I don't want to leave anything out. And in response to that doubt, listeners can open their browsers and enter USCCB Matthew. That's USCCB Matthew. And there, on the website of the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops, in the closing paragraphs, they will read that the author of the Gospel according to Matthew is unknown. But for, open quote, convenience, close quote, the USCCB will continue to call him Matthew. So, and the USCCB also appears to doubt that evangelists Mark and John wrote those Gospels. And this is consistent with the, quote, Markan priority to source theory, close quote, promoted in Catholic seminaries and universities and in mainstream Protestant seminaries as well as the best explanation of gospel origin. I'll come back to this after a few comments about the book, if I may, but as I explain in the book, in particular the addenda articles, this theory that we don't know who wrote the Gospels falls like a house of cards.
What inspired you to write this book?
Well, I was raised and educated in the pre-Vatican II, as it has been called, golden age of Catholicism. And I was on military leave in Rome in June 1963, the day that Pope John the 23rd died. And almost alone in St. Peter's Basilica, I saw the tiered seating of the Second Vatican Council and, above a side altar, Michelangelo's Pietà, Jesus dead in the arms of his afflicted mother at the foot of the cross. That moment would soon seem darkly prophetic. The unauthorized, quote, spirit, unquote, of Vatican II seemed more and more at odds with what I knew to be true about the Church and Catholic doctrine. My wake-up call came in about 1971 at an orientation for religion teachers at our parish. And the pastor looked at me and said, Forget everything you learned about the faith at the University of Scranton, Jerry. The church has changed. I wrote my first book, published in 2001, as a kind of life preserver to help believers stay afloat in that increasingly stormy sea.
Now, that first edition of about 250 pages has become a second edition of almost 500 pages, published just 6 months ago. What would you like to tell us about it?
Well, again, the title is The Seven-Step Reason to be Catholic, second edition. Science, the Bible, and history point to Catholicism, with addenda clearing the historical critical fog. Here are the 7 steps. 1. Uncensored science points to a creator. 2. Only Jesus had a resurrection. 3. History and martyrs affirm the Gospels. 4. Jesus founded only one church. 5. Jesus commissioned only the apostles. 6. Their successors, Catholic bishops. And 7, there's no biblical escape clause. And there are 4 parts to the book. Part 1 provides detail about the 7 steps. And part 2 is revitalizing faith in the wake of scandal and dissent. And part 3 outlines the key beliefs of 14 major religions and belief systems and how they differ from Catholicism. And that's followed by the 7-step wallet outline in 12 languages. And finally, part 4 is, quote, addenda clearing the historical critical fog, unquote, unquote. These articles, one published in the Fellowship of Catholic Scholars Quarterly, soundly refute the theory that the Gospels are anonymously written hearsay and restore gospel truth.
Jerry, let me play devil's advocate with you. You acknowledge that in their books, articles, and classrooms, most biblical scholars today promote the theory that we don't know who wrote the Gospels, which makes the Gospels unwitnessed hearsay, open to any interpretation. What evidence do you have that the evangelists did write the Gospels?
Well, let's start with St. Irenaeus, one of the very early bishops of the Catholic Church. He made it clear that the Gospels were written by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and in that order, Apostle Matthew writing first. Here is what Irenaeus wrote, open quote, Matthew also issued a written gospel among the Hebrews in their own dialect, while Peter and Paul were preaching at Rome and laying the foundations of the church. After their departure, Mark, the disciple and interpreter of Peter, did also hand down to us in writing what had been preached by Peter. Luke also, the companion of Paul, recorded in a book the gospel preached by him. Afterwards, John, the disciple of the Lord, who also leaned upon his breast, did himself publish a gospel during his residence at Ephesus in Asia. And that's from Against Heresies, Book 3, Chapter 1, Paragraph 1.
That certainly seems definitive. What do we know about Irenaeus?
Yeah, Bishop Irenaeus was taught by Bishop Polycarp, who was taught by Apostle John. Bishop Polycarp chose martyrdom rather than revile Christ. Bishop Irenaeus succeeded a bishop who was martyred, and he wrote what I quoted while his own life was at risk under Roman Emperor Commodus. I call that high credibility.
I agree, but have other early church fathers affirmed the Gospels?
Yes. In the book, The Faith of the Early Fathers, Volume 1, Father William Jurgens cites other early church fathers who affirm the authenticity of the Gospels. For Matthew, 14 citations. Mark, 14. Luke, 13. John, 10.
Well, that sounds like a solid case for the four evangelists writing the Gospels. Has the church made an official statement on this?
Yes. In the Vatican II document Dei Verbum, we read that that the apostles and others of the apostolic age, quote, handed on to us in writing the same message they had preached, the foundation of our faith, the fourfold gospel, according to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, unquote.
But in a 3-minute video on your website, you say a grenade was thrown into Catholic seminaries soon after Vatican II. Tell us about that.
Yeah, the grenade, as I call it, was Markan priority. The idea that the gospel according to Mark, not according to Matthew, was written first, and that the gospel according to Mark is more credible. That this theory was first proposed in Germany by Protestant theologian Gottlob Christian Storr in 1796.
But all four Gospels have been approved by the church, as you said. Why should it matter which was written first?
Well, there are two gospel accounts of what Jesus said to the apostles near Caesarea Philippi. In the gospel according to Matthew, Jesus says what so widely has been spoken about, open quote, "Who do you say that I am?" And Peter answers, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." And Jesus answers him, "Blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah, for flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father who is in heaven. And I tell you, you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the powers of death shall not prevail against it. I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven, and whatever you bind on earth shall be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven." Then he strictly charged the disciples to tell no one that he was the Christ, unquote. But in the gospel according to Mark, Jesus says, "But who do you say that I am?" Peter answered him, "You are the Christ." And Jesus charged them to tell no one about him.
So by having Mark written first, it can be argued that Jesus never gave Peter any special authority in the church or gave him the keys.
Yes. And in Matthew, Jesus also refers to the church singular that he is founding. The omission of that in Mark reduces the Catholic Church to just another of the tens of thousands of faith traditions carrying the Christian banner today.
So was the Catholic Church wrong for 2,000 years until this Markan priority correction in the 1970s?
Well, no, certainly not. Let's take a close look at St. Irenaeus. After writing that Matthew wrote the first gospel, St. Irenaeus tells us Mark wrote what had been preached by Peter. So in Rome, with Nero's agents listening, Peter would have been foolish to call his followers to a kingdom to which I hold the keys. Peter would not have preached those words. And that explains why they are not in the gospel written by Mark, but are in the gospel written by Apostle Matthew, who was there and heard Jesus say those words to Peter. Now, this fact alone collapses this Mark wrote first theory for any honest biblical scholar.
Again, a good defense of the evangelists as writers of the Gospels, but that makes it even harder to explain why, as you write, this theory is promoted in Catholic seminaries. What evidence do you have of that?
I received an email a few years ago from a Catholic priest who was a seminarian in the 70s. And he refers to his instruction as the historical critical method. And by that, he means this Markan priority to source theory. And we know that because his instructor was Father Raymond E. Brown, Catholic champion of this particular theory. And here's what the priest wrote. Dear Jerome, I was taught the historical critical method in the seminary in the 70s by Father Raymond Brown. He saw toward the end of his life how this method could destroy Catholic faith in people rather than build it up. I saw seminarians lose their faith in my class when exposed to the unbridled use of this method. Many were converted by this method to heterodox teachings or beliefs. Others lost their faith and left the seminary. Continuing his quote, the historical critical method calls into question not only the infancy narratives, but also the Immaculate Conception of Mary, the Virgin Conception and Birth, not to mention miracles of Christ and his physical death and resurrection. It really opens old heresies already resolved by the Church. I have 4 of Father Brown's many books promoting this mark and priority theory. One published in 1973, about the time he was instructing this priest, and his last, published in 1997, the year before he passed away. Curious as to how Father Brown could have refuted St. Irenaeus on gospel authenticity, I checked the index of all 4. No mention of Irenaeus. The priest I quoted gave a deeply troubling account of seminary instruction. If today seminarians seem more open to it, that's a reflection of how far instruction of Catholic youth has fallen short of the sure norm for Catholic instruction, the Catechism of the Catholic Church. In the foreword of his book, Jesus of Nazareth, published in 2007, Pope Benedict XVI wrote that the two-source theory places his quote, intimate friendship with Jesus in danger of clutching at thin air, close quote. Since Vatican II, this theory that risks reducing Jesus to thin air has been promoted in most, if not all, Catholic seminaries, and that means it has influenced just about every priest and bishop in active ministry today. And until recently, I thought this mark and priority instruction had not reached seminaries in Africa. And then I met a priest from Ghana who was taught it and accepts it.
But don't you think a lot of seminarians are ordained believing that the Gospels are authentic, written by the evangelists?
Well, I've heard that many seminarians keep their heads down and are ordained, I should say. But unless a seminarian knows why this theory is deeply flawed and indefensible, it may well instill doubt about Jesus and the Gospels. So, is it coincidental that so many Catholics have left the Church? That confession is seen as a relic of the past? And that the great majority of Catholics wrongly believe that just about everyone ultimately goes to heaven? Is it coincidental that we read that the worldwide synod on synodality may lead the Church to approve a sin that cries out to heaven for vengeance? With this mark and priority theory also widely promoted in Catholic academia, is it coincidental that so many young Catholics lose their faith while attending a Catholic college or university?
That's a strong statement, Jerome. What evidence do you have that this theory is still promoted?
Well, a few years ago, I had a conversation with a religious studies professor at a Catholic university, and he said, as the Pope did recently, Pope Benedict, he said, this mark and priority two-source theory is taught everywhere. And he would not hire a candidate who did not favor it.
Again, playing devil's advocate here, maybe there's more to this than you think. You defend the evangelists, but only with reference to Irenaeus and other early church fathers. Is there such a compelling case for the mark and priority theory on its own merits that it overrides your defense of the evangelists?
Good question. This is one of a dozen or more historical critical theories rooted in the Protestant Reformation. It's called historical, but it's not really, because it examines only the textual interrelationships of the Gospels, ignoring well-documented historical sources like St. Irenaeus. Placing Mark first and giving it more credibility than Matthew proved challenging for its proponents to defend. As an apostle, Matthew's gospel was a report of indisputable credibility. He would have had no need for Mark or any other source. Solution: Matthew must have been written by somebody else, not the apostle. No matter that Matthew was cited by some of the earliest fathers of the church with no indication that they were referencing the writing of a pseudo-Matthew. And synoptic analysis revealed a further problem. The gospel written by the unknown Matthew included information about Jesus not found in Mark. The unknown writer of Matthew must have had a second source, a collection of sayings of Jesus, which Protestant biblical exegetes called Q, and in German that means source. So this further two-source tangle of the web, as I call it, has failed, however. After more than 2 centuries of searching, Q has not been found, and its proponents acknowledge that without Q, the theory is untenable. And Catholic scholar Brant Pitre underscores this. In his book, The Case for Jesus, he wrote, quote, "No manuscript of Q has ever been found. No reference to Q is ever made in the writings of the Church Fathers."
But isn't it true that scholars have published many books and articles promoting this two-source theory?
Yes, but they continue to presume the existence of the second source they call Q. But if we ask, has Q been found? They will answer no.
If tomorrow we read in the news, scholars have found Q, what would you say?
Well, I'd say, which Q?
Which Q? What do you mean?
Well, scholars differ as to what sayings of Jesus must be included in Q. And so I would have to ask which Q was found, Q1, Q2, Q3, and so on. Q1 would satisfy some scholars, but not others. I can imagine a brave seminarian or lay university student saying, "Professor, with this mark and priority two-source theory, it seems you've given us a package of epoxy glue. It comes in 2 tubes, one resin, the other hardener. Mixed together, they form a strong bond. But without the second tube, there can be no bond. You acknowledge that Q, like the second tube, has never been found. Your theory, therefore, collapses. It does not discredit Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John as writers of the Gospels."
That would be one courageous student.
I can imagine, but that student would be right.
It seems you've left little room, if any, for a defense of the Markan priority two-source theory. But as you say, it remains the dominant explanation of the gospel origin in Catholic seminaries and universities. Why?
I wish I had the answer. What I can say is that the Second Vatican Council in the early 60s placed bishops in a difficult position. The decree on ecumenism called them to dialogue with other Christians, but do so without presenting any obstacle to Christian unity. But the keys of authority Jesus promised to Peter had been an obstacle to Christian unity ever since 1517, when Luther denied the Pope had them in his thesis, and that would be number 26. Many bishops solved the problem, or apparently thought they had, by embracing the Markan priority two-source theory, which canceled the Petrine keys of authority, as we've said. allowing ecumenism to proceed.
Do you think those bishops foresaw the cataclysmic spiritual, moral, and cultural consequences of their decision to discredit the evangelists and, as Pope Benedict wrote, risk reducing Jesus to thin air?
Well, I don't know, but what I do know, as I wrote in the book, is that we now have a peer-recognized historical critical Matthean priority to gospel theory. This is a Matthew wrote first theory that is consistent with the compelling historical affirmation of gospel authenticity by Irenaeus and other early church fathers. And actually, this development clears the way for Catholic bishops and leaders in Catholic colleges and universities to restore the gospel authenticity that brought the church to its pre-Vatican II golden age.
Well, I absolutely think your book will be of great interest to listeners and viewers, both Catholic and Protestants, Jerome.
Well, thanks, Logan. For some reason, I wasn't able to order the ebook through the Amazon and Kindle apps, but both ebook and paperback versions are available through the Amazon and Barnes & Noble home pages, and of course from Pro Isle Publishing through my website, 7stepcatholic.com. And viewers will find articles of mine at 7stepcatholic.com with much more detail on this subject. And as I may have mentioned, one article was published in the Fellowship of Catholic Scholars Quarterly, and many of those scholars teach this Markan priority theory as the best explanation of gospel origin, not always willingly, as I have been told, by at least, well, one, maybe more than one of them. It is telling that no scholar replied to me attempting to defend it based on that article. The good news is that the USCCB has no authority over any bishop or leader in Catholic academia. And for those leaders, it all comes down to their personal responsibility before the Lord to provide instruction conducive to eternal salvation. And to this question: will I continue gospel instruction through the lens of Gottlob Christian Storr, rooted in the Protestant Reformation? Or will I restore gospel instruction through the lens of Irenaeus, rooted in Christ?
Wonderful, well put, well said, well argued and defended. We really appreciate your time here today on Spotlight, Jerome.
And thank you, Logan, for having me. Thank you very much.
My pleasure. And to the folks at home, I'm Logan Crawford, thanking you for your time this time. Until next time on Spotlight.